Large brands like Patek Philippe make superstars like Ed Sheeran wait years and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get his watch customized. And when I say customized, I mean merely changing the city name on a world timer. So what if I told you that instead of buying a clomage to the Rolex Explorer that would endlessly remind you of how you don't own the Rolex Explorer, you could spend under $100 and customize your very own watch from start to finish using AliExpress parts. Considering that this is my 5th watch, you'd think that everything would be a little bit more smooth sailing compared to the rest of my other builds, but in fact, this watch build had to be one of my worst watch builds, whereby actually breaking the movement was the least of my concerns. So in terms of the parts, this uses a smooth bezel Datejust-esque case alongside a presidential bracelet, a beautiful, beautiful white mother of pearl dial that's just stunning in the sunlight, and dauphine hands with lume plots, and all of this is being powered by a very special NH34. Also, my mom chose all the parts for this build because this is her watch. And as mentioned before, I had problems with every single part in this build. I almost forgot to mention, I'll be leaving the product links in the description, and they are AliExpress affiliate links, so it does mean that I do get a little bit of commission if you use the links, but it doesn't come at any extra cost to you. So I would definitely appreciate it if you use them if you were interested in purchasing some of the watch parts. So I actually cracked this watch's dial. And you're probably wondering, how did you do that? Well, if you haven't watched my previous AliExpress build, I definitely recommend checking that out after you're finished watching this video. In my previous build, I accidentally broke the NH34's quick set date and quick set GMT function, rendering it a time-only movement. And since my mom didn't want a date function, that movement was perfect for this watch, or so I thought. One thing to keep in mind when trying to build a watch that's powered by the NH34 is that most of the dials are fit for the NH35, meaning that you're going to have to enlarge the center hole so that it fits on the NH34. And I didn't have any real problems with that on my previous build, but for some reason on this build, I think it might have come down to me not being that careful, but when I tried to enlarge the hole, I accidentally cracked the dial, and now there's a crack that stems from the center, and there's actually another crack at the 3 o'clock, and the reason for that crack was that I tried to file down the dial feet after I took them off with my tweezers, and then I think I shaved it down a little bit too much, and then it ended up cracking the front. For some reason, after building 4 other watches, I've never cut the stem too short, but for some reason in this build, I cut the crown stem too short, so I had to use another crown stem and do it all over again. It wasn't a huge deal, but it was still kind of annoying. I've never had problems with cases not being cut properly. And in this case, what happened was at the very bottom, the inside of the watch case, there were some parts of stainless steel that were left on the case. It's kind of difficult to describe, and I didn't get any video recording of it, but what I had to do was once again file it down and get rid of those protruding pieces of stainless steel that interfered with the dial. Another thing to mention is that when I tried to fit the case onto the watch movement with the dial and the handset, I realized that the dial wasn't on the movement properly. It actually would shift from one side to the other. So what happened was when I pressed one side down, the other side went up, and when I pressed the other side down, the other side went up, and I really tried my best to figure out out what was going on. I thought potentially maybe I cut the dial feet too short, or I didn't cut them enough. And I tried to troubleshoot the problem, but I really couldn't figure it out. So I just ended up putting the watch case on the watch movement, and right now it seems to be doing just fine. If you're enjoying this video, I would definitely recommend commenting down below what your thoughts are on this watch. If you have built your own watch, just try to start a conversation down below, because as always, I respond to the majority, if not all, your comments. So definitely recommend doing that. And if you're enjoying this video, I would appreciate it if you hit that like button and hit that subscribe button, as it really does help out the channel and comes at no cost to you. This watch really does glimmer and glisten in the light because of this mother of pearl dial. When you shift the watch from side to side, you can see a plethora of different colors in the watch dial itself, and I really don't think that the B-roll of this watch does it justice. You really have to see this dial in person to understand how pearlescent and beautiful it is in the flesh. One thing I do want to mention is that although the cracks are very visible in the B-roll, in person they're not noticeable whatsoever. Even from this viewing distance, I actually cannot tell where the cracks are, and that's the reason we didn't replace the dial. This is also quite a versatile piece because with the presidential bracelet, I think it is a little bit more dressy than it on a NATO strap or an Explorer bracelet. Bracelet watches are often perceived as more formal on women than compared to men. Also, I wanted to use the NH05 originally, but I found that when I was scouring the internet for parts, the majority of the parts kind of looked the same. There was no variety, so I ended up just settling and building this watch with an NH34. Additionally, the dial looks a bit lackluster without a logo. I think it would benefit from some sort of logo. This also comes off as a little bit more dressy than a Rolex Explorer, because a Rolex Explorer is almost entirely brushed with the exception of the polished bezel that this watch also shares. However, this watch has a mixture of polishing and brushing. Okay, let's be completely honest. Obviously, this isn't going to rival a Rolex Explorer in virtually any domain outside of pricing. This doesn't have the same level of polishing, doesn't have the same level of brushing, doesn't have the same level of movement. But in terms of the original design you get with this watch for under $100, that also pays homage to a Rolex Explorer, I really do think that it's quite an interesting value proposition. I actually prefer the handset of this watch with the dial. Very, very unpopular opinion here. The Mercedes hands with the Rolex Explorer's black enamel dial is a little bit dissonant with the design language, whereas I think these dauphine hands go really well with the style, and I think it is more cohesive than Rolex's own design. So this comes in at 36 millimeters in terms of its case diameter and 48 millimeters in terms of its lug to lug, and a strapaholic 20 millimeters in terms of its lug width. And that's why I put it on a presidential bracelet and an oyster bracelet, because it's really easy to swap out the different straps and bracelets on this because of how strapaholic that lug width is. Also, in terms of comfort during extended wear, I would say that this presidential bracelet is quite comfortable due to how articulate this bracelet is, and also due to the fact that the edges aren't sharp. There's no real sharp parts to this watch, whereas when I reviewed some Pagani designs, I noticed that the bracelets were sharp on the insides. However, there is a huge caveat to this particular presidential bracelet that I'll get into when I talk about the cons of this watch. This is obviously powered by the NH34, and it's been running at plus 10 seconds or so per day. This NH34 has 40 hours of power reserve, and also this has a sapphire crystal and a stainless steel construction for the rest of the body. I would say that the lume on this watch is relatively strong. It doesn't last too long, but in the B-roll that you'll see now, it is actually quite vibrant. It's actually quite strong. And in terms of legibility, the legibility on this watch isn't that great compared to, say, a pilot's watch. I think that it has a surprising amount of legibility for a watch that has white hands and a white dial. Unless you have an 8-inch wrist, this really doesn't allow for a comfortable wear. And that comes down to the fact that the front of this bracelet doesn't have any removable links, but the back half of this bracelet has a lot of removable links. So what ends up happening is, you kind of see this? The bracelet clasp kind of protrudes on one end, and when you end up wearing it, it protrudes either on the front or the back of the wrist, depending on how you fit the bracelet. And I think that's a really unfortunate part of this build, and I'm looking to change the bracelet on this watch in the future. The build process cons and the caveats with this watch come along with that low price tag. There are some serious quality control issues from these AliExpress vendors, and as someone mentioned in my other videos, this isn't AliExpress's fault. It just comes with the nature of purchasing from these AliExpress vendors. So as I mentioned from my other video, I would say that if you want a seamless beginner experience of building a watch, I would recommend checking out DIY Watch Club, because I do think that their kits are quite comprehensive and they have great instruction resources online that allow for the whole experience to be quite seamless. However, I do think that NamokiMods has an upper hand on the quality of the parts. But nonetheless, if you pick DIY Watch Club or NamokiMods, both of those watch part suppliers are not going to have the same quality control issues and just blatant problems that these AliExpress watch part vendors have. And I would say, if you're willing to take on a serious challenge and you're willing to risk losing some money due to quality control flaws or breaking parts more easily, because I find that AliExpress parts are a little bit more fragile than some other watch part suppliers, then I would say that it does offer an interesting value proposition, but you're not going to find a ton of different variety in terms of design language outside of Rolex inspired parts. So if you're interested in finding some seriously original parts, then I would recommend checking out DIY Watch Club or NamokiMods. If you're interested in watching my 4 other watch builds, which I think are quite entertaining, I would definitely recommend checking out some of the videos listed over here. And with all that in mind, I just want to thank you so much for watching the video, making it to the end. And I hope that this watch channel patinas like your favorite watch. I'll see you on another episode on the time ticker.